And then we'll go to the prophets after Esther, and we'll begin to look at the prophets. And throughout Israel's history, that would, of course, lead up to the coming of Christ. Of course, it hasn't been too far removed since Israel went through what we call the Holocaust, and a very awful time in this world and through their history, of course. But that wasn't the first attempt upon the nation of Israel to exterminate the people, and of course it's not the last attempt, sadly. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the story of what happened to the minority of those Jews, perhaps as few as 20%, who returned to Jerusalem after the decree of Cyrus. The book of Esther describes what happened to the majority that decided to remain. Esther is the second of two biblical books named after a woman. The other is the book of Ruth. And you can compare and contrast. When you can contrast Ruth and Esther, Ruth was a Gentile who lived among Jews. Esther was a Jewess who lived among Gentiles. Ruth married a Jew, Esther married a Gentile. In obedience to Naomi, her mother-in-law, Ruth's faith is rewarded. In obedience to Mordecai, her uncle, Esther, and all the Jews are saved. The eventual outcome in both stories is determined through a midnight conversation. Ruth had a talk with Boaz in Ruth chapter 3, and then Haman's talk with the king in Esther chapter 6, verse 1 through 10. So the events in Esther transpired during the 60-year period between chapter 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra. Remember when we were in Ezra and we said that 60 years, there's a 60-year gap between chapter 6 and chapter 7? Well, Esther helps us fill that in. Okay, and Esther is the only biblical book in which all the events take place in Persia. Okay, and Esther records the most horrible example of anti-Semitic hatred in the Bible, as seen in the actions of Haman. This vicious henchman was the Adolf Hitler of the Old Testament, and the subsequent hanging of wicked Haman also offers the most vivid object lesson, fulfillment of the prophecy in Genesis 12:3. And I will curse him that curseth thee. Okay. Esther is one of two biblical books in which the name of God is not mentioned. The other is Song of Solomon. But yet we see God moving. Okay. God operating in his people. But the question we ask to that would be why? And one reason may be to illustrate the hidden but providential care of God in spite of the outward appearances. There's no other book in all the Bible in which God is more evident working behind the scenes than in his book. Providence may be defined as followed. It is that continuous agency of God by which he makes original design with which he created it. Can also be thought of as the hand of God in the glove of history. Providence is the last of three great facts which make up the sovereignty of God as witnessed by man. Of course, God created, and that's why we have the existence of the universe. So creation. Then preservation, which accounts for the progress and development of this universe. And God's preserving, and you see all that. And So when we find in the book of Esther, we see this providential care even in that as well. It's sort of like this too. Another, the name of God, his title, his great title, Yahweh, does appear in acrostic form 4 times in the Hebrew text of the book. And Esther records the only mention of the Feast of Purim, chapter 4, verse 14, an observance to celebrate the deliverance of the Jews from Haman. So, and of course, we know when they would use this term, they wouldn't pronounce it. It was a holy name for God, and you know. And then when they wrote it, it was very. It looked at as very sacred, and they would you know, write one letter at a time, and it's a YHWH. And so it was, you know, they respected that name. They respected God. Now, of course, we know that people just throw his name around, sadly, loosely. The longest verse in the Bible is found in Esther chapter 8, verse 9. It contains 90 words. And that'd be a good trivia question, or if you ever want to teach or preach on it, I want to preach today on the longest verse found. Esther is the 24th longest Old Testament book. It is quoted or alluded to 3 times by 2 New Testament books, and the events cover 10 years from 483 to 473 BC. Sort of like, too, when you think about God operating, but not in right there, but he's always, his providential care is always there. Jesus was the same way. When Jesus ministered on earth, he was God in the flesh, okay? And everything he did was God in the flesh type stuff, okay? Everything he says, you know, on certain occasions, believe me, if you won't believe it, believe me, at least for my work's sake. What are we saying? Well, if you go back in my life, everything I've done, all the works I've done has been God works, okay? And so they could look. I mean, Jesus did clearly state who he was. A lot of people try to say Jesus skirted around it or didn't really. Jesus clearly over and over again stated who he was, and that he was God in the flesh. But if you just looked at his works, if you just looked at, you know, his character, everything about him was that, okay? So in the same way, when we look to Esther, we'll see all through it God, okay, and God's providential care. All right. So let's jump right in and think about Esther, the rise of Esther. And in chapter 1, verses 2 through 21, you have the rejection of Vashti. Ahasuerus was the Persian king who ruled from the city of Susa over 127 provinces, stretching from India to the Upper Nile. He had made Vashti his queen. During the 3rd year of his reign, the king hosted a 180-day celebration for his nobles and officials. This was followed by a 7-day banquet. So on the 7th day of the feast, when he was drunk, the king ordered Vashti to parade herself before his drunken cronies. So he's going to show her off, okay? Which, you know, I guess some would revel in it, some would be embarrassed by it, and some would reject it. Well, she refused to do it, okay? And she wasn't going to do it. So the king, this is the story, the king was, of course, mad. And upon the advice of his intoxicated officials, divorced her, okay? And sadly, we sort of look at this and say, how stupid. People get divorced over the stupidest things today too.
Amen.
Things haven't changed much, okay? And, then the king said it says, then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And you see this in chapter 1, verse 13, verse 15, 16, verse 17, and 19. And in the end, verse 19, that Vashti come no more before the king, and let the king give royal estate unto another that is better than she. So don't let her show you up. So there you go, pride. How many times is pride in marriages? On both parts. And then they have to, if you notice too, then each one has to make the other one look very bad, very evil. So they'll both have their friends that will tell, because they got to make them look bad, awful in other people's eyes, maybe even their kids' eyes, to help. Yeah, you shouldn't be with that person, and then the other one's doing it to the other. And so pride and then all that enters in. However, upon sobering up, that's another thing, the destruction of alcohol. And people doing stupid stuff, immoral stuff, to their own families because of alcohol. Sobering up, he repented of his hasty action, but could not rescind his original command under Persian law. So there's another element. There's some stupid laws. We live in a land where there's some stupid laws sometimes. And if you did something and, they'd say, well, that's the law. You say, well, wait a second. This just ain't right. It's the law. Okay? So you see that there. To appease the frustrated king, an empire-wide search was conducted to find a new queen. Okay, so it goes back to that statement there, royal estate unto another that is better than she. Okay. Well, this is going to enter into chapter 2 where we see the selection of Esther. Esther, also called Hadassah. And this is another popular name used in that nation. And we even have a politician. He's retired now, but his wife was named this. And he ran for vice president back a few years ago. And Esther was from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, the little old Benjamites. Old Benjamin had put out some pretty good people through the years. She was a very beautiful girl, chapter 2, verse 7. She was raised up in the city of Susa in Persia by her cousin Mordecai, verse 5 through 7. She won this beauty contest and became the queen of the king. Verse 17 and verse 18. Now the reason for all this, also in part to compensate for his recent defeat at the hands of the Greeks, it should be understood that a period of some 4 years elapsed between the divorce of Vashti and the marriage of Esther. The following is a summary of events which took place during that period. In the spring of 480 BC, the king crossed the Dardanelles with more than 100,000 men and hundreds of ships. History tells us he wept while watching the dazzling display of his smartly marching armies, all carrying their brightly colored flags and banners. When asked why he wept, the king replied, "Because I know all this military glory is but for a moment and will soon fade away forever. Because in much less than 100 years from now, every man present here today will have died, myself included." That's true. We need to take a look, at things and just know, where's it all headed? Where's it all going? And then disaster struck soon after, for he lost 400 ships in a severe spring storm at sea. In blind frustration and anger, he beat upon the stormy waters with his belt. Upon landing in Greece, his proud Persian troops were stopped for an entire day at the mountainous pass called Thermopylae. Here, a Greek captain named Leonidas and his 300 brave Spartan soldiers held back the entire invading army for 24 hours, inflicting great losses on them and allowing the much smaller Greek army to carry out an orderly retreat to safety. So he eventually broke through and burned Athens to the ground, but most of its citizens had escaped to the island of Salamis. And the king then set sail for Salamis, confident of victory, for he outnumbered his enemy at least 3-1. But the smaller and swifter Greek fighting boats had mastered the art of ramming. Soon before his horrified eyes, he viewed the slaughter of his proud navy. He left for Persia a defeated man. And the remaining troops were put under the command of General Mardonius. 1 year later, Mardonius was defeated and killed in a pitched battle at Plateau in 479 BC. The Persian Empire was then dealt the final blow. J.F.C. Fuller's well-known book, The Decisive Battles of the Western World, lists the battles at Salamis and Plateau among the most important in recorded history. But eventually she's selected. She doesn't reveal herself as a Jewish girl yet. Okay, they just know she's beautiful. Okay. Mordecai, who had become a palace official, overheard a plot of 2 guards at the gate to assassinate the king. Chapter 2, verse 19 through 23. He reported this to Queen Esther, who in turn informed the king. Both guards were executed, and this was all duly recorded in the book of the history of kings, Ahasuerus' reign. Later on, he would be assassinated in a similar plot. The lies of Haman, chapters 3 through 5. Infernal servitude. Soon after Esther had become queen, the king appointed as his prime minister a vicious politician named Haman, an unwitting servant of Satan himself. He was from the Amalekite descent. Again, God had a solution to the problem of these things happening down the road, but Israel didn't fully obey God. So when they went into the land, they didn't fully obey God, and rooting out the Amalekites and these tites and these tites and that type. And it would come back to haunt, just as God knew it would. His elevation to the position of prime minister by the king caused him to swell with pride. So, he's real proud of himself. He's made it to the top. He's not a servant leader, but he's a master leader. He's going to let everybody know he's got the authority. So he's not humble at all. He's very heartless as well. He instigated the first attempted Holocaust in history upon learning that Mordecai was refusing to bow down and honor him as he walked by. So he's a cocky guy and he expects to be honored. Mordecai wouldn't do it. Verses 5 through 6 in chapter 3. He began by lying about the Jews to the king, claiming they were disloyal and urged that they be destroyed. So, see, so you're going to be lied about, okay? Especially when you live for God. People are going to lie on you and say certain things. And you see that in 7, in verse 8. So he ends up in verse 8, therefore, he says, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. So it doesn't help you at all to let them live. Okay? He even offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver to cover the expense incurred in this proposed bloodbath. So a lot of, had money, and I'll take care of the expenses. He hated the young man. To Haman's surprise and delight, the king not only agreed to his proposal, but said Haman need not pay anything to finance the slaughter. Verses 10 and 11 of chapter 3. After signing the death warrant, both men sat down and relaxed over a drink, verse 15 of chapter 3. Royal riders were sent forth to announce this edict of execution, which decreed that all Jews would be killed on February 28th of the following year, 473 BC, verses 12 through 15. But Mordecai knew who to go to. Mordecai loved the Lord, and Mordecai trusted the Lord, and Mordecai knew God had God had an answer. And upon learning of the decree of death, Mordecai immediately identified with his people and went into deep mourning. Chapter 4 now, verses 1 through 3. Unaware of the new law, Esther learned of her cousin's sorrow and inquired concerning the reason behind it. And Mordecai informed her and advised that she visit the king immediately. Chapter 4, verse 7 through 9. Esther pointed out to him that she had not been summoned to the king's inner court for 30 days, and to walk in uninvited would very possibly bring instant death. Okay, so I won't have a pride problem on the king and all his people. Mordecai answered with what is perhaps the key statement in the entire book. So we'll read chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So why has God brought you to this place, Esther, for such a time as this? Why has God brought you to the places in your life, to the positions that you hold in your life for such a time as this? Okay? Even though the name God as such is not mentioned in Esther, surely Mordecai had his deliverance in mind here. Then shall deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. And he uses, and then thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Not only did Esther later save the Jews in Persia, but also those living in Palestine, for the death decree included them too. In addition to this, Esther no doubt exercised a great influence upon her stepson, Artaxerxes, who later proved to be so kindly disposed toward Ezra and Nehemiah. So she had influence on Artaxerxes, which would rise to the kingdom. And remember, he would be so generous to Ezra and Nehemiah as they went back to rebuild Jerusalem. Esther immediately ordered a 3-day fast among the Jews. This is found in chapter 4, verse 15 through chapter 5, verse 14. There.